Imagine you are a knight in 14th century Europe. You have spent your entire life becoming what you are. You started training at 7 years old. By the time you were a teenager, you could ride a horse at full gallop in complete darkness and hit a target with a lance. By the time you were 20, you had trained for more hours than most people today spend in formal education. And the product of that training was a human weapon so effective, so specialized, so physically imposing, that entire kingdoms paid fortunes to have you on their side. Your armor alone cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Your horse was bred over generations for courage and strength. On the battlefield, you were the most dangerous individual combatant alive. You were the apex predator of medieval warfare, and you knew it. Now a peasant with 6 weeks of training and a metal tube filled with powder and a lead ball points it at you from 50 meters away and presses a lever. And everything you are, everything you trained for, everything your entire social class was built upon, everything that gave the nobility of Europe its power, its wealth, its unquestioned military supremacy, becomes irrelevant in the time it takes for a spark to travel down a fuse. That is what the gun actually was when it arrived in the world. Not just a new weapon. A social revolution disguised as a piece of military hardware. A device that transferred power, real political and military power, away from people who had spent decades and fortunes building physical and martial superiority, and handed it to anyone who could learn to load and aim a metal tube in a matter of weeks. No invention in the history of warfare more completely or more permanently transferred the balance of military power between social classes. And the story of how it happened, starting with a mistake in a Chinese kitchen over 1,000 years ago, is one of the most consequential chains of accident and invention in all of human history. Stay here. Because the real story of how guns were born is nothing like the version most people know, and by the end of this video, you will understand not just how gunpowder was invented, but why the people who invented it spent centuries trying to use it for everything except the thing it ultimately changed the world with. The story begins in Tang Dynasty China, sometime around the 9th century CE, and it begins with people who were not trying to make a weapon at all. They were trying to achieve immortality. Chinese alchemists of the period were engaged in what they called the search for the elixir of life, a substance that would grant eternal youth and physical immortality. This was not fringe pseudoscience by the standards of the era. It was serious scholarly pursuit, backed by imperial patronage, conducted by some of the most educated people in Chinese society. And their methodology, whatever we might think of the goal, was genuinely experimental. They mixed substances. They heated compounds. They recorded results. And somewhere in that long process of systematic mixture and observation, someone combined sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, potassium nitrate, in roughly the right proportions and applied heat. The result, according to a 9th century Chinese military text that recorded the accident almost as a cautionary warning, was that the mixture ignited violently, burning the hands and faces of the experimenters and setting the building on fire. The text does not describe this as a discovery. It describes it as a dangerous mistake that alchemists should avoid. The formula was recorded specifically so that future practitioners would know not to accidentally replicate it. That warning, that cautionary note about a mistake, is the first recorded description of gunpowder in human history. The single most consequential military technology in the history of organized warfare was discovered by accident, recorded as a warning against accidental rediscovery, and then spent the next 3 centuries being used for almost everything except killing people. Here's where the story takes the first of several turns that most accounts of this history completely miss. The Chinese did not look at gunpowder and immediately think gun. They thought fireworks. They thought signal devices. They thought incendiary weapons, yes, but incendiary in the sense of fire arrows and fire bombs, things that burned and terrified, not things that fired projectiles. The fire lance, one of the earliest Chinese gunpowder weapons, was essentially a tube of gunpowder attached to a spear, designed to produce a burst of flame and smoke at close quarters. It was terrifying. It was psychologically devastating to enemies and horses who had never encountered anything like it. But it was not a gun. It produced a controlled burn rather than a controlled explosion, and it was used as a fire weapon, not a projectile weapon. The leap from controlled burn to controlled explosion, from fire lance to actual firearm, required a specific insight that took significantly longer than you might expect to arrive. The insight is this. If you contain an explosive burn in a strong enough tube with one sealed end, The expanding gases have nowhere to go except out the open end, and they will push whatever is sitting in that open end outward with extraordinary force. The tube becomes a cannon. The object in the open end becomes a projectile. The explosive force of the burn becomes kinetic energy transferred to the projectile at a speed no human arm or mechanical device of the era could match. This insight arrived in China, again by a process of gradual experimental development, rather than single dramatic invention, sometime around the 12th century CE. The earliest confirmed depiction of an actual firearm, a bronze vase-shaped device clearly being used to fire a projectile, appears in Chinese artwork dated to around 1127 CE. The earliest surviving physical firearm is a Chinese bronze hand cannon dated to 1288, currently held in a Chinese museum. It is small, crude, and would be barely recognizable as a weapon by later standards. But it is unmistakably a gun. A tube, sealed at one end, with a touch hole for ignition, designed to fire a projectile through the force of contained explosive combustion. Stay with me now, because this is where the story leaves China, and the chain of transmission that followed is one of the most consequential pieces of technology transfer in human history. Gunpowder knowledge traveled west along the Silk Road trade routes in a process that was gradual, imperfectly documented, and almost certainly involved multiple independent partial discoveries alongside genuine knowledge transfer. The Islamic world had contact with Chinese gunpowder formulas by at least the 13th century, as evidenced by Arabic military texts from that period that describe both the formula and incendiary applications. European knowledge of gunpowder appears in the writings of Roger Bacon, the English friar and early scientist, around 1267 CE, though the formula he recorded appears deliberately obscured, possibly for fear of the knowledge falling into dangerous hands. The first confirmed use of cannon in European warfare is generally dated to the early 14th century, with the Battle of Crécy in 1346 often cited as one of the earliest documented engagements where primitive cannon were deployed by English forces. The cannon at Crécy were crude, unreliable, and probably contributed more psychological shock value than actual battlefield effectiveness. But they were there. They fired. And the people on the receiving end of whatever these strange thundering metal devices produced had no framework within which to understand what had just happened to them. The psychological dimension of early gunpowder weapons is one of the most underappreciated aspects of their military history, and it's worth spending a moment on it because it explains patterns in early firearms adoption that otherwise seem irrational. Early cannon and early firearms were, by any purely practical military measure, inferior to existing weapons in almost every specific respect. A trained English longbowman of the late medieval period could fire 10 to 12 accurate arrows per minute at ranges exceeding 200 meters. An early matchlock musket required up to 90 separate steps to load and fire. Achieved accuracy, perhaps a fraction of the longbow's effective range, was dramatically affected by wet weather, took several minutes to prepare for firing, and had a meaningful chance of exploding in the firer's hands at any given discharge. By every objective military metric of the early period, the gun was a worse weapon than what it eventually replaced. And yet armies adopted it anyway, kept investing in it, kept developing it, kept fielding it despite its obvious practical inferiority. Why? Because the psychological impact of the noise, the smoke, the flash, the complete unfamiliarity of the experience was something that no amount of physical preparedness or military training could fully mitigate. Horses that had been trained for years to stand calm in the chaos of medieval battle broke and fled from cannon fire. Formations of soldiers who would have held against a cavalry charge cracked under the psychological pressure of an attack they could hear and smell before they could see, that produced wounds unlike anything familiar, that seemed to violate the known rules of how battle worked. The gun was a psychological weapon before it became an effective physical one, and that psychological effect bought it enough time in military adoption to survive long enough for the engineering to improve. And improve it did. Here is where the pace of the story accelerates, because once the basic principle was established and military investment began flowing toward the problem, the development of firearms technology moved through several generations of improvement in a timeline that compressed centuries of previous weapons development into decades. The matchlock mechanism, developed in Europe in the early 15th century, standardized the ignition process, replacing the manually applied burning match cord with a mechanical system that held the match in a clamp and brought it into contact with the powder pan through a trigger mechanism. This sounds like a minor refinement, but its military implications were enormous. It freed both hands for aiming rather than requiring one hand to manage ignition separately. It made the weapon operable by people with significantly less specialized training. It standardized the firing mechanism enough to allow something approaching mass production. The matchlock musket was a worse weapon than a skilled longbowman's bow by almost every individual performance metric. But it could be produced in quantity, operated by soldiers trained in weeks rather than years, and drilled into formation tactics that multiplied its effectiveness beyond what any individual performance measure captured. This is the central dynamic of all firearms development from this point forward, and it is one of the most important patterns in all of military history. The gun did not succeed because it made individual soldiers more capable. It succeeded because it made individual soldier capability less important. It democratized lethality. It allowed armies to be built from the available population of physically ordinary human beings, rather than from the rare subset who had dedicated their lives to achieving extraordinary physical and martial skill. More soldiers, trained faster, at lower individual cost, capable of delivering lethal force at ranges that made individual physical prowess essentially irrelevant. This is the revolution that the gun actually delivered. Not better weapons. Different weapons that made the definition of a soldier fundamentally different. Now here comes the turn that changes everything about how you should understand this history. The part almost no popular account discusses directly. The people who understood this dynamic earliest and most clearly were not military commanders or weapons developers. They were the political and social structures that depended on the existing military balance of power remaining exactly as it was. The feudal nobility of Europe had built an entire social and political order on a single foundational premise. Military power required resources, training, and hereditary privilege that only they could provide. Knights cost fortunes. Cavalry required generations of horse breeding and rider development. Castle construction demanded capital that only landed nobility controlled. All of this created a military barrier to entry so high that political power was inseparable from aristocratic birth and inherited wealth. The gun dissolved that barrier with a directness that the nobility recognized almost immediately as existential. Several European monarchies attempted to restrict firearms ownership, specifically to prevent commoners from accessing weapons capable of defeating armored cavalry. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I banned civilian ownership of short firearms in 1517. Various Italian city-states implemented similar restrictions. These bans were not primarily about crime or public safety in any modern sense. They were explicit attempts to preserve the military and therefore the political supremacy of the social class, whose power depended on that supremacy remaining unchallenged. They failed. The military advantages of firearms were too significant, too practical, too useful to the states competing against each other for survival and dominance, for any individual ruler's restriction of civilian access to prevent military adoption at scale. Once one army had muskets in quantity, every competing army needed muskets in quantity, and once muskets were being produced in quantity for military use, restricting civilian access became progressively more difficult, and progressively less militarily relevant anyway. The transformation of European warfare between roughly 1450 and 1650 is one of the most dramatic military social revolutions in history. In 1450, the dominant battlefield unit was armored cavalry, expensive, elite, representing the concentrated military investment of the aristocratic class. By 1650, the dominant battlefield force was infantry armed with firearms, led by professional officers, supplied through organized logistics. Drilled-in formations developed specifically to maximize the effectiveness of volley fire from weapons that remained individually inaccurate but became devastatingly effective in coordinated mass deployment. The aristocratic knight did not disappear instantly, but he was demoted from the apex predator of the battlefield to one expensive element within a larger system whose center of gravity had permanently shifted. And that shift on the battlefield produced reverberations through every level of European society that continued for centuries. Armies of infantry required money, not just land and horses. They required taxation, supply systems, administrative infrastructure. States that could build that infrastructure could field effective armies. States that could not compete militarily regardless of the quality of their aristocracy. The result was a gradual consolidation of power toward centralized states with effective taxation and administration, and a gradual erosion of the independent military and political power of the feudal nobility that had no equivalent source of revenue and no equivalent administrative infrastructure to draw upon. The gun did not cause the end of feudalism single-handedly, but it removed the military foundation on which feudal power rested. It made the knight obsolete. And in making the knight obsolete, it began the slow unraveling of the entire social order the knight embodied and protected. That peasant with 6 weeks of training and a metal tube, the one standing across from the knight at the beginning of this story. He was not just holding a new weapon. He was holding a transfer of power so complete, so irreversible, so structurally fundamental, that it would take centuries to fully play out. But that was, from the moment the spark hit the powder, already inevitable. Every war fought after gunpowder arrived was shaped by its presence. Every political structure that emerged from those wars was shaped by who could produce, afford, and deploy firearms most effectively. Every social hierarchy that evolved in the centuries following its adoption was shaped by the fact that physical superiority and hereditary martial training no longer determined who won when armies met in the field. One accident in a Chinese alchemist's workshop. One cautionary note in a military text warning people not to repeat the mistake. And 900 years of human history. Hundreds of millions of lives, the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of social class from something militarily enforced to something politically negotiated. All of it tracing back to a fire that nobody meant to start, in a building that burned down, in a dynasty that no longer exists, in a search for immortality that found something else entirely. They were looking for a way to live forever. What they found instead changed how everyone else died.